Anybody who knows me knows that about once a year, if I find something interesting, I kind of wrap my whole attention onto it, for better or for worse. I remember when I got into the band U2, I got all their CDs and must have listened to The Unforgettable Fire and Joshua Tree millions of times. And the same happened with Mozart and The Who and Led Zeppelin and Miles Davis. Well, at the time I write this, the beginning of 2026, I have just discovered a fascination with the English romantic William Blake. I had heard some authors and poets quote him in interviews and such, but initially I didn't think anything of it. I once saw a post on Instagram from a poetry account I follow, which said, "I see through my eyes, not with them." This quote was attributed to William Blake, but on Instagram you never know if somebody's not just using someone else's name to seem more profound. Either way, it made me more familiar with Blake's name at the very least. Then one day I was walking through a bookstore and stumbled across a book of his art. I hadn't known that Blake was an artist, too, and a good one at that. His art even being featured on the cover of Daniel J. Borstein's The Seekers, a book I had bought and fallen in love with just a few months before getting into Blake. This bookstore find sparked my interest in his work, so I did a bit of research and found out that he lived a fascinating life. It's interesting, I recently wrote a piece which used Joan of Arc's death sentence as the text, and I got the same feeling reading about Blake that I did reading about Joan. Apparently, he saw many visions of angels and demons. His wife Catherine even said, "I have very little of Mr. Blake's company. He is always in paradise." Of his dead brother, Blake said, "With his spirit I converse daily and hourly in the spirit. I see him in my remembrance. I hear his advice, and even now write from his dictate." Both Blake and Joan were considered to have been at least a little mad, but deep down you know that you'd be sorely mistaken to ignore them completely. A full description of Blake's religious views could take up a whole episode, but it's important to note that he considered himself a follower of Christ, but certainly not in the traditional sense. According to a Yale University Press article by Leo Damrosch, it seems clear that Blake regarded the historical Jesus as a great prophet, but not as the unique incarnation of God on earth. Jesus was perhaps endowed with exceptional divine inspiration, but if so, he differed from the rest of us in degree, not kind. A rather shocked Crab Robinson reported, "On my asking in what light he viewed the great question concerning the divinity of Jesus Christ, he said, 'He is the only God.' But then he added, 'And so am I, and so are you.'" Strikingly, Robinson adds, "Now he had just before, and that occasioned my question, been speaking of the errors of Jesus Christ." Furthermore, Blake had a totally, shall we say, unique idea of the crucifixion. The same article says this: "According to Orthodox theology, God could not forgive our sins until the innocent Christ permitted himself to be executed on our behalf." "That is a horrible doctrine," Blake told Robinson. "If another man pay your debt, I do not forgive it." To glorify the crucifixion, therefore, struck Blake as altogether blasphemous, since he saw it not as a divine sacrifice, but as a judicial murder of the historical Jesus. In the Keys of the Gates, appended to For the Sexes, he challenges believers to justify their use of the crucifix. "O Christians, Christians, tell me why you rear it on your altars high." In the spirit of his times, Blake was also a staunch nonconformist, supporting both the American and French revolutions. He was also strongly against slavery, the abuse of people by the church, and tyranny in general. Perhaps his ideology is best summed up in his line, "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's." Blake was defiantly and radically individualistic, going against many of the old traditions and customs in an almost violent way. But as you might or might not expect from Blake, he was also strongly against the Enlightenment. When you read Blake, you almost get the idea that he considered the imagination to be one of the senses. He championed it over logic and reason, flying in the face of so many of the main components of the Enlightenment. The artist in him hated the idea that there was to be a particular order and judgment unrelated to organic emotion in anything he created. Another characteristic of Blake that pleasantly surprised me when I was learning about him was his world building. I've always had a deep appreciation for world building and have even dabbled in it myself. The worlds of Tolkien and Lewis have always seemed so amazing and inviting. But Blake's world was different. His writings seemed to have a much deeper and more thorough philosophy, a quasi-religious agenda behind its teachings. like a prophet trying to tell us something. The best way I can think of describing it is Blake does the opposite of what lots of other artists do. So much of art is an attempt to give gods and legends a more human character, to create a stronger sense of accessibility. Like Ivan Kramskoy's Christ in the Desert, it is an almost brutal depiction of the very human story we read in the Gospels. Lots of examples of this type of human divinity can be found in the Iliad as well. The gods have a very close relationship with the human characters. These works and so many others are trying to say legends and gods may be divine, but they aren't remote. Blake's world, however, creates a new mythology for our world today, a seemingly inverted process from the works previously mentioned. Besides creating beautiful settings and powerful imagery, Blake's myth provides relevant metaphysical context to events happening in his day. One of his main creations, the god Albion, represents primitive man. His fall and division create the Zoas: Urizen, Tharmas, Luva, Orc, Urthona, and Los. Urizen, perhaps the most famous of Blake's creations, is the embodiment of reason. Tharmas is the embodiment of sensation. Luva is the embodiment of love and passion. Orc is the embodiment of rebellion, and Los, the embodiment of creativity. By assigning themes and consistent characters to each of the Zoas, Blake explains historical events like the revolutions and figures like John Milton by involving the leadership of one of these Zoas in his descriptions of actual historical happenings, giving human activities a divine and righteous connotation. It's fascinating and incredibly dramatic, but you have to carefully consider what this might mean. More importantly, what this might mean to William Blake, and perhaps most importantly, what Blake is helping us understand about the world around us. In Socrates' Euthyphro, which literally means right-minded, Socrates discusses the idea of objective moralism and its potential hazards to the notion of multiple gods who author morality. Socrates believed that there was an objective right and wrong, but he rejected the morals of the gods of ancient Greece. The teaching of the ancient Greeks was that morality came from their multiple gods, but you don't need to read too much about Greek myth to see that the gods don't get along all that much. They have different wills, wills that clash and clash often. Does this mean that there are different variants of moralities, or maybe different degrees of moralities that subscribe to different gods' unique wills? If so, then that would mean that morality is not objective, but subjective, depending on which god is most pleased by an action. Or maybe some gods, like Zeus, are better to obey than others, like maybe Hermes. In that case, the status of the god you are trying to please with your actions is of critical importance, and you must consider your conditions to find out which god could help improve them. That leads us back to the dilemma of relative morality, because one god at one time is the author or at least decider of good, not this other god. In this scenario, morality is subjective and relative. But what if we took a different route and said something is considered holy, pious, or correct if all the gods believe it is true? In that case, that supposes the pre-existence of another good or another truth which the gods are subscribing to, a good outside of the gods, a good that is good unto itself, unrelated to how the gods feel about it. Then the fact that the gods agree on an action is not a judge of the goodness of an action, but an illustration of the goodness of an action, since the gods' agreement on the goodness of an action does not make it good. Just like everybody agreeing that the White House is white doesn't make it white. So, if the gods' agreement is not the judge of the goodness of an action, but only the illustration, would it be possible for 99% of the gods to agree that something is good, and 1% of the gods to be wrong and disagree? This still would imply an objective, higher, ultimate good outside of the gods' opinions, of which the 1% of gods are falling short. In this scenario, will is objective. Who then is the author of this ultimate good? If you ask Blake, it is the God of the Bible. God is all-powerful, sovereign, and the unchanging author of good. He is perfect, and we are not. But we are His creation, and we make horrible mistakes and hurt one another frequently. Did God make a mistake when creating us? Are we hired incorrectly? No. That brings me to one of Blake's most profound poems. It's called The Human Abstract, and it is found in the book Songs of Innocence and of Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. First published in 1794, the book is perhaps Blake's most well-known work, and it's a wonderful illustration of Blake's dual poetry, where he presents two themes and contrasts them, a common thread in lots of his work, though he wrote and bound them separately when he first completed them. Each of the poems are paired with one of Blake's famous engravings. The Human Abstracts engraving is of an old bearded man trying to free himself from ropes while kneeling in front of a tree and a muddy river. The figure is Urizen. The ropes represent religion, and the tree is the tree of mystery, a reminder of Blake's staunch pushback against the often esoteric institution of the church. The Human Abstract is found in the Song of Experience, the latter of the songbooks, and is paired with a poem called The Divine Image. Here it is. To mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God, our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress prays to the human form divine. Love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form, in heathen, Turk, or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell. There God is dwelling too. It's an incredible poem, and it so powerfully conveys the responsibility humans have in being merciful, loving, and pitiful to one another, and how those things please God. The Human Abstract takes it even further and provides an answer to the question of why there might be so much terror and pain in our world. Here is the Human Abstract. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor, and mercy no more could be if all were as happy as we. And mutual fear brings peace till the selfish loves increase. Then cruelty knits a snare and spreads his baits with care. He sits down with holy fears and waters the grounds with tears. Then humility takes its root underneath his foot. Soon spreads the dismal shade of mystery over his head, and the caterpillar and fly feed on the mystery. And it bears the fruit of deceit, ruddy and sweet to eat. And the raven his nest has made in its thickest shade. The gods of the earth and sea sought through nature to find this tree, but their search was all in vain. There grows one in the human brain. This is among my favorite poems by Blake, and among my favorite poems in general, because it doesn't let humans off the hook. It points a finger at all the ways in which we hurt each other, but it does so in a way that you might not expect. It starts off by addressing the age-old question: if God is good, why do bad things happen? When I read the poem, I sort of keep the first bit in my head throughout the entire thing. Yes, there is bad in the world. Yes, we hurt each other. But that's not the end of the story. The first 4 lines are so powerful. It really made me rethink all of those so-called negative emotions and experiences. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor, and mercy no more could be if all were as happy as we. Here, Blake is saying, we all know that poverty and sadness are bad, but they produce pity and mercy, and that's worth something. The we in question is up for debate. It could be Christians. It could be a non-specific people who are just happy in general. The next 2 lines transition to the dark and somewhat grotesque imagery of the next section. They say, and mutual fear brings peace till the selfish loves increase. The first part of this pair of lines provides another picture of a positive from a negative. The phrase mutual fear could mean that when 2 parties fear each other, they are scared enough to avoid confrontation. Or it could mean something like how the Bible describes a fear of God. When 2 groups experience a common fear of something, like God, they have a commonality and thus a connection. But the abuse of that fear turns into selfish love, a distortion of something good into something horrible. The next lines read like this. Then cruelty knits a snare and spreads his baits with care. He sits down with holy fears and waters the grounds with tears. Then humility takes its root underneath his foot. Here, cruelty is personified, and the first letter of his name is capitalized. He creates a snare, a trap. There are two ways of reading into this. The first is to read that cruelty carefully baits and ensnares. The other, my personal preference, is that cruelty creates his baits and traps by using care, and spreads his baits with care, distorting another good into a horrible derangement used to hurt others. Further painting a picture, Blake says he sits down with holy fears and waters the ground with tears. Cruelty here is kneeling, stooping down to reach, in active movement, in initiation. Not only that, but he sits with holy fears, something that can be understood as good, perhaps, and then waters the grounds with tears, which, if we continue, give birth to humility, but its immediate condition is under cruelty's foot. This has all sorts of implications we could read into. Something good, humility, is produced by something negative, but not harmful, tears, and is then persecuted by something negative and harmful, cruelty. The next lines are again metaphorical. Soon spreads the dismal shade of mystery over his head, and the caterpillar and fly feed on the mystery. The word his in the last segment referred to cruelty, so I think it follows that the his in this segment also refers to him. The tree of mystery is shown to grow over his head, something large, larger than cruelty who produced it, something which looms over all, producing a dismal shade, a shade which creates depression. The caterpillar and fly might represent lowly creatures that eat from this mystery, maybe those who profit from the ignorance and feebleness of others. This reading is seemingly in line with Blake's stark views on organized religion. Certain flies and caterpillars are crucial pollinators of some fruits, which again reflects a kind of active effort to augment this persecution. Next we have, "And it bears the fruit of deceit, ruddy and sweet to eat, and the raven his nest has made in its thickest shade." The tree of mystery is now producing deceit, which is partaken by whoever might profit from it. The raven could represent a dark trickery, especially when described as making its nest in the tree of mystery's thickest shade. The last lines read like this: "The gods of the earth and sea sought through nature to find this tree, but their search was all in vain. There grows one in the human brain." This is a beautiful summary of the poem, and I think of Blake's ideology on religion in general. It suggests that the tree of mystery is not natural. The gods didn't create it. They don't even know where to find it. Cruelty created it, and it's in everybody's brain. It's a part of everyone now. Some readers might notice the similarities between Blake's tree of mystery and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil found in Genesis, which becomes more apparent when reading the four Zoas, night the seventh. It is also interesting to note that Adam's fall created a new nature according to the Bible, just like cruelty creating the tree of mystery and putting it in the human brain according to the last line. Before finishing up, I'd like to briefly go back to the first bit, the seeds of the story, so to speak. The whole poem is all about how man distorts and takes advantage of the initial natural state of man. But that's not to say that the initial natural state of man is all positive. Blake begins the poem with pity and mercy and illustrates them as responses to poverty and, by implication, sadness. And going back to the question of, did God make mistakes when creating man, I should now like to add, did God make mistakes when creating man to not be 100% prosperous 100% of the time? I would also answer no to this question. God uses these negatives to create positives. There would be no forgiveness without something to be forgiven. There would be no loving "I'm sorry" without something to be sorry for, a wrong to be righted. God is glorified through these extensions of pity and tenderness. We humans have a short-sighted view of pain and tough situations in general. We tend to think of them as punishments or evidence for the absence or even non-existence of God. But Blake is imploring us to take a closer look at the big picture. Similar to the story in the Gospels when Jesus heals the blind man, his disciples illustrate the short-sighted view of hardship that I'm getting at. John 9 says, "As he, Jesus, went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?' 'Neither this man nor his parents sinned,' said Jesus, 'but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him.'" God uses these negatives to create positives, but man uses these negatives to create further negatives. Deceit, selfish gain, hatred, pain, distance, and so many horrors. According to Blake, humans are the authors of evil because evil is a distortion of the good that God creates. But God uses the evil of humans to create positive responses and heartfelt connection. The Human Abstract made me want to read more by William Blake, and I was not sorry. I strongly recommend his works because I don't think you'll be let down.